been a long time since I watched JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Same time since I've uploaded, so you know what? I figured I miss big, buff, and sweaty men fighting each other in a homoerotic context. So I decided to go all the way from the beginning on my rewatch of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Phantom Blood.
Because I'm not a filthy parts.
I remember when I first watched this part, I thought it was okay. In fact, I really had to fight the urge to skip it. But my friend who introduced the series to me at the time told me to stick to it, and honestly, I'm glad I did. Phantom Blood objectively is the weakest part of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which sucks because it's literally the beginning of the show. And unsurprisingly, my opinion on part 1 didn't change at all. And after my rewatch, I do have to admit, Phantom Blood is kinda mid. But that's okay, because I can appreciate it for what it had to offer. The best part of this part is easily Dio and Jonathan. I mean, they hard carry this part. My opinion on Jonathan as a character drastically changed on my rewatch. Initially, I thought he was boring and one-sided, but I realized he was actually much more deeper than that. Jonathan Joestar is the poster boy of a do-gooder. He reminds me of Superman, in which actually they're extremely similar in their ideologies and characterization. Superman is a beacon of hope and a symbol of humanity. He sees the good in people when others don't. He represents the inherent goodness of the human spirit, and all of these are also character traits of Jonathan Joestar. Like Jonathan, I also thought Superman was bland and uninteresting, but as I grew older, I began to understand what made Superman such an important character. In a world of hate and selfishness, a person like Jonathan or Superman is rare to find. What's important about Jonathan is his ability to empathize with anyone, even his enemies. Hell, it was his empathy that led to Speedwagon have a change of heart and greatly admire Jonathan as a person. And I think that's one of the common themes within Phantom Blood, of the human ability to empathize with others. And one of my favorite examples of this has to be Jonathan's fight with Bruford. More on that later. And speaking of empathy, empathy or compassion, after all, is a primary characterization of humanity, which puts into perspective that when Dio exclaimed to Jojo that he was throwing away his humanity by becoming a vampire, he literally and metaphorically did throw away his humanity as he threw away his compassion towards others, or what little of it he had left. And speaking of Dio, there's a common misconception about his character, in which it's believed that he was born evil. And even Speedwagon stated this in the anime, but I actually don't think that's the case. We knew Dio had a source of compassion within him, as it's implied with Dio's love and respect for his mother. What sent Dio down his dark path really was his inability to accept his pain. And pain is another characterization of humanity. The pain that Dio felt when losing his mother due to the actions of his father and then spending years mistreated by his father and by others would lead him to lose his belief in the humanity of others. Dio just couldn't handle the pain he endured from his life, which factors into his decision of throwing away his humanity. It's funny because Dio and Speedwagon actually have similar backgrounds. And I also believe that Speedwagon probably shared the same idea that he needed to mistreat others in order to survive in the world. But ultimately, what I think the difference was between the two was that Speedwagon saw the compassion Jonathan gave towards him that Dio didn't see at first. Also, slight spoilers for Steel Ball Run if you haven't read it yet, but we see an alternate version of Dio, Diego, turn out much better than Dio. Although, he's still an asshole. But because he was raised by his mother, who showed him compassion, he turned out a lot better than Dio. Which is why I think Dio wasn't born inherently evil. And what I mentioned before about the outcome of the Jonathan and Bruford fight, it shows how important pain can be to define one's humanity. When Bruford turned back to human, the first thing he felt was the pain of living. And Jonathan empathized with Bruford in that moment, because Jonathan felt that same pain within his journey. I mean, he had a turbulent childhood with Dio, he lost his father, and then most recently his mentor and friend. But despite all of that, it was because of his courage that he was able to venture through that pain and use it to his advantage to make him stronger, thus showing the indomitable will of the human spirit, which Bruford recognized by changing the words of the sword he gave to Jonathan from luck to pluck, which means bravery. This pluck and the ability to go through mental anguish is something that Dio lacked. And because of that, Dio respected Jonathan even more in Jonathan's final moments. Because Jonathan showed that despite all the suffering he endured from Dio, he was still empathetic towards him. And that scene of Jonathan dying with Dio's head in his arms is just narratively amazing and a perfect way to end their dynamic. Now moving on to the negatives of this part, which I do think is a lot, but I'll give you like a short rundown. Despite the things I learned to appreciate from my rewatch of Phantom Blood, I still think that this part was generally weaker compared to the parts that followed it. I mean, Jonathan and Dio are very solid characters, but I just feel the rest of the cast had nothing to offer. Speedwagon was basically useless and provided unnecessary narration. I mean, Phantom Blood really flipped the term show not tell on its head by telling us every single detail as if we were blind. Although I do think it's ironic how Speedwagon didn't contribute much to this part, but has an everlasting legacy within the series because of the Speedwagon Foundation and all that shit. But, you know, in part 1, he's just the cardboard cutout that follows Jonathan around. Also, William Zappelli did jack shit as well. He was severely underutilized, which I feel is a shame because I thought he was a really cool character. I get the whole point of Zappelli's character was his sacrifice for Jonathan, but I just really wish he had more screen time. Or even the whole part had more screen time. The pacing of this part was like dog shit, and it moved too quickly and yet still felt slow and dragged on in certain scenes, especially scenes with Speedwagon providing narration. But, you know, despite all the pacing issues and inconsistencies, as I proved by all the good Part 1 provided, it's not bad at all. It's just mediocre compared to what the others parts offer, which is understandable since Araki's writing and storytelling do progress with each part. Overall, for my rewatch, I really appreciate Part 1 for what it had to offer and the amazing series it started. So, you know, I'll give it like a 6 out of 10. Solid 6 out of 10.
Still mid though.